Okay, so we're going to start our Civil War unit. We have done several articles with some background information. So your task now is to kind of build that background information by reading what is on these slides and going through and filling them out. So on the first one, it's a KWL chart. So that's what we know, what we want to know, and then what we have learned at the end. So today, what you're going to do is you're going to fill in the K part. This is what you already know about the Civil War. And you can just make this a list of all of the things that you already know. It doesn't have to be just what you've read about in the articles that we have completed. It can be things that you know from beforehand, maybe something you learned in fourth grade, maybe something you've read about in a book. Just make a list here. And then for the W, you're going to make a list of things that you would like to know about the Civil War. And at the end of the unit, we're going to fill in the L. So you're not doing anything here yet. So you're going to fill in the K and the W on your slides. And then you're going to go through and you're going to read all of the slides. So in this one, we're studying this standard where at the end, you will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the economic, political, and social divisions during this time period. Sectionalism led the United States into a costly and devastating civil war, which ultimately resulted in the preservation of the United States of America. Okay, and so you're only going to read this first part of the slides. They're the Civil War basics. You're going to go through slide 16. 16 is the last slide that you're going to go through today. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. I'm not going to read them all to you. You're going to take the time and read these slides. And then at the end, there will be a video that you will need to watch. Okay? So you're going to learn what is a Civil War, when it was fought, who the people were in the Civil War. So there's several different slides full of information, and you have a copy of these that you're going to look through. Okay? There's lots of maps, there's some timelines, there's a few questions. So you're going to kind of, after you've gone through this, you're going to ask yourself some of these questions. We're going to discuss some of these in class when you return.
During the 1800s, the United States was a diverse country, and it was growing rapidly. Churches doubled the size of the United States and vast expanses of land for settlement. The Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803 blazed a trail to the west coast. This led the way for many pioneers to follow. The pioneers were leaving crowded cities and looking for cheap land, and if available, free land. They followed the Oregon Trail and several other trails west. It was a journey that lasted several months. This westward migration became much easier when the railroad connected the east to the west. In the eastern part of the country, there were great differences between the northern states and the southern states. In the north, there were large industrial cities where many people were employed in manufacturing. The southern states were agricultural. Most of the people in the south were farmers. There were many disagreements between the North and the South. It was becoming clear that the nation was divided both economically and politically. The South didn't want a powerful federal government. They wanted each state to set their own laws. This was called states' rights. Another disagreement was over slavery. The North and South made several agreements or compromises to avoid a conflict like war. The South didn't want the North telling them what to do. Trouble was brewing. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Northerner, was elected President of the United States. He believed in a strong central government making laws for the states, and he wanted to stop the spread of slavery. At this point, the southern states began to secede or leave the Union. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union in December of 1860. Over the next 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas left the Union. They formed their own country called the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as the president of the Confederacy. The North said that secession was unconstitutional, and they were ready to use military force to keep the South in the Union. The South claimed it was no longer ruled by the North and would not reconsider. A civil war is one in which people from the same country fight against each other. The Civil War began in April of 1861 when the Confederacy demanded that Union soldiers leave Fort Sumter in South Carolina. When the Union soldiers refused to leave, the Confederates fired their cannons at the fort. After the Confederate forces captured Fort Sumter on April 14th, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded. For some Americans, it was difficult to decide which side to choose. Even the border states between the North and South had a hard time deciding which side to support. President Lincoln asked Robert E. Lee to lead the Union Army. Lee, being a Virginian, decided to join the Confederate Army instead. General Stonewall Jackson helped lead the Confederate troops. He became Lee's top general when Lee became the Army commander in June of 1862. General George McClellan was the first to lead the Union forces. He led the Union forces in the Battle of Bull Run near the town of Manassas Junction, Virginia. It was the first battle of the Civil War, and the Union lost. Because McClellan proved to be a poor commander in several battles, Lincoln decided to replace him. Eventually, Lincoln would make General Ulysses S. Grant the commander of the Union Army. While men were away fighting, many women were working on the farms and in factories back home. Some women helped the armies as spies and nurses. Clara Barton, a former teacher, delivered medical supplies and nursed injured soldiers on the battlefield. She was called the Angel of the Battlefield. In 1862, Lincoln told the Southern states that he would free their slaves if they did not return to the Union by January 1st, 1863. When the Confederates ignored him, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in all the Confederate states. Lincoln also hoped that it would encourage many African Americans to join the Union Army and help fight the war. At the beginning of the war, they were not allowed to fight, but now they were needed. Eventually, more than 179,000 joined the fight. Issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was also a political move. President Lincoln hoped that the Europeans who were opposed to slavery wouldn't help the Confederates if slavery were an issue in the war. The Confederates were hoping the Europeans would support them by buying their cotton. The Europeans decided to remain neutral. To prevent the South from trading for needed goods, the North used warships to blockade Southern ports. In November 1863, President Lincoln was invited to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, for a dedication of a national cemetery. Gettysburg was the site of one of the worst battles of the war, with many lives being lost on both sides. It was there that he made his famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. There were many battles during the Civil War, but only two were fought in the North: the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Gettysburg. Both ended with the Confederate troops retreating back to the South. All other battles were fought in the South. The destruction this caused hurt the South for many years. Their farms and factories were ruined. They had no food or goods to sell, and no money to buy the things they needed. Some of the greatest destruction didn't come from battles, but from a plan to destroy the South's will to fight. General William Sherman led 62,000 soldiers on a 300-mile march from Atlanta to Savannah. They marched in a path 60 miles wide, destroying everything they found along the way. It was known as the March to the Sea. By the spring of 1865, the South was losing the war. The cities of Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, along with numerous smaller towns, were left in ruins. Though few cities in the North were damaged, many Northern soldiers died. People on both sides thought the war would be a short one, but it had lasted far too long, and everyone was growing weary of fighting. By April of 1865, General Lee's troops were starving and wearing rags, while General Grant's soldiers were well fed, clothed, and armed. Lee and his army were facing defeat. The war ended on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where Lee and Grant met. They shook hands and talked as old friends. Then Lee agreed to Grant's terms of surrender. When Union soldiers fired cannons to celebrate the surrender, Grant stopped them and told them, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." After 4 years of fighting, from 1861 to 1865, the Union was restored. President Lincoln had succeeded in keeping the country together. On April 14th, after Lee's surrender, but before the fighting was over, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. A Southern sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, shot him. Lincoln died the next day. The country was torn with grief. They had lost their president, and over 600,000 people had died in the national conflict. The war was hard on everyone, but it was physically and economically devastating for the South, where most of the war took place. With the end of the war, leaders looked to reconstructing the nation. The Congress passed acts establishing military rule over many Southern states until new governments were formed. The Congress also passed 3 amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment made the Emancipation Proclamation law, and slavery was prohibited throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment promised equality to all citizens. The 15th Amendment granted every American male citizen the right to vote, regardless of color. Education, which had not been available to slaves, was now an option. Schools were opened and thousands came, eager for the opportunity to learn. But life wasn't different in many other ways. The problems of integrating the freed slaves into Southern life existed for many years. They were no longer slaves, but they were not yet treated as equals. Segregation and discrimination replaced slavery as a Southern way of life. The Civil War made the federal government much more powerful than each independent state. More importantly, it changed the way people viewed the country. People no longer saw it as a group of states making up a country. They now saw a union of states forming a nation.